Andrew Collins had spent years mastering control. Every decision in his life was calculated, every move planned with precision. But in the span of a single evening, everything he thought he knew was ripped away. It started as a simple act of kindness, buying two little girls teddy bears in a toy store. He hadn't expected anything in return, hadn't given it a second thought. But then their mother turned around, and in one heartbeat, his entire world came crashing down. Because the girls weren't just strangers. They were his daughters. And he had never even known they existed. Andrew Collins had spent the entire day in back-to-back meetings, negotiating deals and reviewing contracts, barely stopping long enough to take a breath. His life was a constant stream of numbers, strategies, and corporate decisions, and that was exactly how he liked it. He thrived in control, in precision, in knowing exactly what the next step would be. But by the time evening rolled around, something inside him told him he needed a break. Not the kind of break that involved expensive restaurants or business events, but something simpler. That was how he found himself walking into a small toy store, the kind he hadn't stepped into since his own childhood. The moment he entered, he was met with the soft chime of the doorbell and the scent of new plastic and plush fabric. Shelves were lined with colorful toys, from stuffed animals to action figures, board games to dolls. He didn't even know where to start. He wasn't the kind of man who bought toys, but earlier that day, his business partner had casually mentioned his daughter's birthday, and for some reason, Andrew had decided to pick out something himself instead of just sending an assistant. Maybe it was an attempt to do something a little more personal, or maybe he just needed to clear his mind, but either way, here he was, walking aimlessly down an aisle, feeling completely out of his element. As he scanned the shelves, his attention was pulled by the soft voices of two little girls standing a few feet away. They were identical, blonde hair, bright blue eyes, dressed in matching white dresses, their small fingers clutching plush teddy bears as they inspected them closely. They looked to be around 5 years old, their voices filled with excitement as they compared the toys in their hands. "This one is cuter," one of them said, hugging a white teddy bear against her chest. "No, this one is better," the other insisted, holding up a brown one. Andrew wasn't sure why he stopped to watch them, but something about their enthusiasm made him pause. They were debating so seriously, their tiny faces scrunched up in concentration, as if they were making the most important decision in the world. Then, after a moment, one of them flipped over the price tag and her expression changed. She turned to her sister and whispered something, and just like that, the excitement dimmed in both of their eyes. "We can't," the first girl mumbled, lowering her gaze. "Mom said no toys today," the second one added, shifting her grip on the bear as if she were reluctant to let go. Andrew felt something unexpected tighten in his chest. He had spent his entire life around wealth, around people who didn't think twice about spending thousands on things they didn't even need. Seeing these two little girls hesitate over something as simple as a stuffed animal felt strangely out of place in his world. Before he even realized what he was doing, he stepped forward. "What if you take both?" he asked, his voice calm but warm. The girls turned to him in unison, their big blue eyes wide with surprise. "Really?" one of them asked hesitantly. Andrew nodded, reaching for both teddy bears from the shelf. "Really? If you like them, you should have them." The second girl tilted her head, studying him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Why?" He let out a small chuckle at her caution. "Because sometimes people should get nice things, just because." The first girl's face lit up with pure delight, while the second one still seemed unsure. But when she glanced at her sister's excitement, she finally gave in, her small hands gripping the bear tighter. "Thank you, mister," the first one chirped, bouncing slightly on her feet. "You're really nice," the second added, her smile growing. Andrew found himself smiling too, something rare and unexpected. "I try." As he walked them to the register, the girls stayed close, whispering to each other in hushed voices. He could tell they weren't used to this, to random acts of kindness from strangers, and for some reason, that made him feel even better about doing it. When the cashier rang up the bears, Andrew handed them to the girls himself, watching as they hugged them tightly, their joy so pure and unfiltered that it almost caught him off guard. "Make sure you take good care of them," he said, not sure why he suddenly felt so invested in this small moment. "We will," they promised in unison, their matching voices making him chuckle. Then, just as quickly as they had entered his evening, they turned and ran toward the exit, their excitement carrying them forward. Andrew watched them go, shaking his head slightly at how such a small act had turned into something oddly meaningful. He turned back to the shelf, ready to finally pick out a gift and leave, but just as he reached for a toy, something made him glance toward the door again. The girls had run straight into the arms of a woman standing just outside, their little hands tugging at her sleeves as they excitedly showed off their new toys. She bent down, brushing a strand of dark brown hair behind her ear as she listened to them, her lips parting slightly in surprise. Then, as if sensing his gaze, she looked up. Andrew's entire body went still. His heart slammed against his ribcage, his breath catching in his throat. Because standing there, holding on to the hands of the two little girls, was a face he hadn't seen in 5 years. Kate. The name barely left his lips, but he knew she had heard it. Her expression froze, her grip on the girls tightening, her blue eyes locked onto his. She looked exactly the same long brown hair, same striking blue eyes, same way her lips parted slightly when she was caught off guard. But this wasn't just an unexpected reunion. This was something bigger. Because now, as he looked at the two little girls holding on to her, their blonde hair shining under the store lights, their blue eyes identical to his own, he felt his entire world tilt on its axis. The girls weren't just random children. They were his. And he had never even known they existed. Kate felt her entire body freeze the moment her eyes met Andrew's. It was a moment she had spent years dreading, the one she had convinced herself would never come. She had told herself that their worlds were too different now, that she had done the right thing by keeping her distance, but as she stood there holding the hands of their daughters, she realized just how fragile that illusion had been. The girls were still tugging at her sleeves, their little voices filled with excitement as they told her about the kind man in the store who had bought them the teddy bears. Kate barely registered their words, her mind too busy processing the fact that the very man she had kept them from all these years was standing just a few feet away, staring at her as if the ground had just been ripped out from under him. Andrew took a step forward, his blue eyes locked onto hers, but there was something different in them now, something that hadn't been there the last time they had seen each other. His gaze flickered to the girls, and Kate saw the exact moment the realization hit him. She knew it before he even spoke. "They're mine," he said, his voice quiet but firm, as if saying it aloud would make it real. Kate felt her throat tighten, her heart pounding so loudly that she was sure he could hear it. She could see the calculation in his expression, the way his mind was racing to fit the puzzle pieces together, the way his hands curled into fists at his sides as he fought to stay composed. "Kate." His voice was different now, rougher, edged with something raw. "Tell me the truth." The girls were still standing beside her, unaware of the storm brewing between the adults. She couldn't do this here, not in front of them, not like this. She forced herself to take a steadying breath before crouching down to their level, tucking a loose strand of blonde hair behind one of their ears. "Why don't you two go pick out a book?" she suggested, keeping her voice light even though her hands were shaking. "Mommy needs to talk to someone for a minute." The girls exchanged a look, clearly sensing the tension, but they nodded obediently before skipping toward the bookstore section a few aisles away. The second they were out of earshot, Andrew stepped closer. "How long have you been planning to keep this from me?" His voice was low, controlled, but she could hear the anger simmering just beneath the surface. Kate swallowed hard. "Andrew. How old are they?" he cut in, his eyes never leaving hers. She hesitated, knowing there was no way out of this now. 5, she admitted quietly. His breath caught for a moment, and he exhaled sharply, raking a hand through his hair as if trying to ground himself. 5, he repeated, almost to himself. So they were born right after. He trailed off, but she knew exactly what he was thinking. Right after she had left. Andrew shook his head, letting out a bitter laugh. So that's why you disappeared. Kate felt a sharp pang in her chest. I didn't disappear, she said, her voice softer now. I made a choice. His expression darkened. You made a choice for me. She flinched at the truth in his words. I thought I was doing the right thing. The right thing? He let out a disbelieving breath, his frustration finally breaking through the controlled mask he always wore. Kate, you kept my children from me. You didn't even give me the chance to decide if I wanted to be in their lives. You just assumed. I assumed because I knew you, she interrupted, her voice shaking slightly. I knew how much you cared about your career, how much you valued your freedom. You told me yourself that you weren't ready for a family, that you didn't want to settle down, that you had bigger things to focus on. His jaw tightened. And you didn't think that maybe I had the right to change my mind? She took a slow breath, trying to hold herself together. I didn't want them to feel like an obligation, Andrew. I didn't want them to grow up knowing that their father only showed up because he felt guilty or pressured. His eyes flashed with something unreadable. Is that what you think of me? Kate hesitated, then shook her head. No. But back then, I was scared. I was alone. And I didn't know if you'd ever forgive me if I told you. Andrew exhaled sharply, his frustration shifting into something else, something closer to hurt. He ran a hand down his face, looking away for a moment before locking eyes with her again. So what now? His voice was quieter now, but no less intense. Do you expect me to just walk away? Kate's chest tightened. No. Good, he said, his jaw set with determination. Because I won't. For the first time since she had seen him again, she truly believed him. Kate had imagined this conversation 1,000 times over the past 5 years. In some versions, Andrew was furious, shouting accusations at her. In others, he was indifferent, confirming all of her worst fears that he would have never wanted to be a part of their daughters' lives. But this quiet intensity, this raw emotion in his eyes, was something she hadn't prepared for. She could feel the weight of his stare as he processed everything, the muscles in his jaw tightening and releasing like he was struggling to keep himself from exploding. She knew Andrew well enough to understand that when he went silent, when his mind was working through the information faster than he could form words, it was only a matter of time before he found a way to take back control. And right now, she could see him trying to figure out exactly where he stood in all of this. He finally exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face before lowering it, his blue eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her stomach twist. I need to see them again. Kate stiffened. Andrew. I'm not asking, he cut in, his voice firm but not unkind. They're my daughters, and I'm not going to pretend they don't exist just because I didn't know about them before today. Kate swallowed hard. It's not that simple. His eyes darkened. It is to me. She looked away, biting her lip. They don't know who you are. They don't know they have a father. Andrew's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something vulnerable passing through his gaze before he masked it with determination. Then it's time they find out. Kate knew this moment would come, but she had no idea how to prepare for it. She had spent years protecting them, keeping them safe from the possibility of disappointment, of a father who might not have wanted them if he had known. But now, standing here, facing the reality she had kept buried for so long, she could see that she had underestimated him. He wasn't walking away. He wasn't lashing out or trying to push the blame on her. He was standing his ground, ready to fight for a place in their lives, and she wasn't sure if she was relieved or terrified. She forced herself to take a breath. They're still inside, she said hesitantly, glancing toward the bookshelves where the twins were flipping through colorful pages, completely unaware of the storm unraveling around them. But this can't happen all at once. I need to introduce you to them the right way. Andrew nodded, his expression serious. How? Kate hesitated. Give me some time. Let me talk to them first, let me explain things in a way that won't scare them or confuse them. They're only 5, Andrew. They don't understand things the way we do. His jaw tightened, and she could tell he hated the idea of waiting, but after a moment, he nodded. Fine. But I want to be part of this, Kate. I don't want to wait weeks or months for you to decide when the right time is. I need to know them. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, she let herself believe that maybe this wouldn't be as disastrous as she had feared. Maybe he really meant it. Maybe he was ready in a way he hadn't been back then. She exhaled slowly. Okay. His brows furrowed slightly, like he hadn't expected her to agree so easily, but she straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze with determination. I'll talk to them tonight. And if they're okay with it, we can set something up for you to see them soon. Andrew studied her carefully before giving a slow nod. Soon, he repeated, making it clear that he wasn't going to let her push him away. Kate's stomach twisted as she glanced at her daughters, their innocent giggles filling the air as they flipped through their books. They had no idea how much their world was about to change. And neither did she. Kate spent the entire drive home trying to figure out how she was going to explain this to them. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror at the 2 little girls in the back seat, their matching blonde heads bent over their new teddy bears, completely oblivious to the storm raging inside her. How did you tell 2 5-year-olds that the man who bought them toys wasn't just a kind stranger but their father? How did you make them understand something so big, so life-changing, without scaring them or making them feel like their world was suddenly unfamiliar? By the time she pulled into the driveway, her hands were gripping the steering wheel too tightly. She forced herself to take a deep breath before turning around in her seat. The girls were still lost in their own little world, giggling as they made their stuffed animals talk to each other. Girls, Kate said gently, waiting until they both looked up. Mommy needs to talk to you about something important, okay? Both of them immediately stilled, their bright blue eyes watching her with curiosity. Is it about the teddy bears? Emily asked, clutching hers to her chest. Kate let out a soft breath. No, sweetheart, it's about the man who gave them to you. Both girls perked up instantly. He was nice. Sophie chimed in, kicking her little feet excitedly. He said sometimes people should get nice things just because. Kate forced a smile, her heart aching at how easily they had accepted Andrew's kindness. I know, baby. But, there's something I need to tell you about him. Emily tilted her head slightly, her fingers running over the soft fur of her bear. What? Kate hesitated, choosing her words carefully. That man, he's someone very special. He's not just a nice person. He's actually someone you were supposed to know a long time ago. Sophie frowned in confusion. Like Mommy's friend? Kate swallowed, her throat tight. No, sweetheart. He's your daddy. Silence filled the car. Emily and Sophie stared at her, their identical faces frozen as they processed what she had just said. Kate knew she had to let them work through it in their own way, so she stayed quiet, giving them space to react. Finally, Emily's little brow furrowed. Our daddy, she echoed, her voice unsure. Kate nodded. Yes, baby. Your daddy. Sophie shifted, clutching her teddy bear tighter. But, we don't have a daddy. Kate felt something twist deep inside her, a sharp pang of guilt and regret. I know, sweetheart. And that's because I made a decision a long time ago not to tell him about you. But I saw him today, and he knows now. And he wants to meet you. The girls exchanged a glance, a silent conversation passing between them that only twins seemed to understand. Kate held her breath, waiting. Finally, Emily turned back to her. "Does he want to be our daddy?" Kate exhaled slowly, nodding. "Yes, baby. He does." Sophie was still frowning slightly. "Will he be nice like today?" Kate's throat felt tight again, but she nodded. "Yes. He wants to get to know you both. But only if you want to meet him." Emily bit her lip, looking down at her teddy bear as if it held the answer. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "Can we ask him questions?" Kate's lips curved into a small, sad smile. "Of course you can, sweetheart." Sophie was quiet for a moment longer before she nodded slowly. "Okay." Kate's heart clenched. "Okay." Emily nodded too, a little more confidently this time. "Okay." Kate felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made her dizzy. She hadn't known how this conversation would go, but now, as she looked at her daughters, so small, yet so open to the idea of something new, she felt the tiniest bit of hope settle in her chest. They didn't know Andrew yet. They had no idea how much their lives were about to change. But for now, they were willing to try. And that was more than she could have asked for. Andrew spent the entire night staring at the ceiling of his penthouse apartment, his mind racing with everything that had happened. He had walked into that toy store thinking it was just another ordinary day, but now his entire life had been flipped upside down. He had 2 daughters, ***2 daughters ***, and he hadn't known they existed until today. The reality of it settled like a weight on his chest, making it impossible to sleep. He had built his entire life around certainty, control, and predictability, but now none of those things existed anymore. He had spent years believing that he wasn't the kind of man who needed a family. He had convinced himself that his career, his success, and the empire he had built were all that mattered. But now, as he lay in the darkness of his bedroom, all he could think about were those 2 little girls. Their matching blonde hair, their bright blue eyes, his eyes ***, and the way they had smiled at him with such innocent trust before running back to their mother. He wasn't sure how he was supposed to process it, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to walk away. The next afternoon, he found himself standing outside a small cafe, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Kate had texted him that morning, telling him that she had talked to the girls and that they wanted to meet him, really meet him ***, not just as the nice man from the toy store, but as their father. He had read her message at least a dozen times, trying to wrap his head around the idea that 2 5-year-olds had already made a decision about him, even before he had figured out what kind of father he was going to be. When the door to the cafe opened, Kate stepped out first, her long brown hair pulled back, her blue eyes scanning his face for something, hesitation, regret, maybe even fear. But he didn't feel any of those things. He just felt like his entire world was about to change, and for once, he wasn't sure if that was a bad thing. Then he saw them. Emily and Sophie stepped out from behind their mother, holding onto each other's hands like they weren't sure if they were supposed to let go. They were dressed in matching yellow dresses, their little faces filled with curiosity as they looked up at him. Andrew's heart clenched so hard he almost forgot how to breathe. Kate cleared her throat softly, glancing down at them. "Girls," she said gently. "This is Andrew." She hesitated for a moment before continuing, her voice quieter. "Your dad." The words sent a strange sort of shiver down his spine. He had been called a lot of things in his life, CEO, billionaire, leader, boss, but never dad. The girls stared at him for a long moment before Emily, the slightly bolder of the 2, took a small step forward. "You're really our daddy?" Andrew nodded slowly, his throat dry. "Yeah," he said, his voice softer than he had expected. "I am." Sophie studied him carefully, tilting her head to the side. "Why didn't you find us before?" The question hit him harder than he had expected. He glanced at Kate, who was already bracing herself, clearly ready to step in, but he shook his head slightly. He had to answer this himself. "I didn't know about you," he admitted honestly. "Your mom didn't tell me, and I didn't know to look." He hesitated before adding, "But I would have. If I had known, I would have looked for you." The girls exchanged a look, silently processing his words in a way only twins seem to understand. Emily crossed her arms. "Are you gonna leave now?" Andrew's chest tightened. "No. I don't want to leave." Sophie chewed on her lip. "Do you have another family?" His breath caught slightly at the question, and for the first time, he realized that was probably one of their biggest fears, that he had someone else, that he had a life where they didn't fit. He crouched down so that he was at their eye level, making sure they could see the sincerity in his face. "I don't have anyone else," he said softly. "Just you two." Emily's expression shifted slightly, as if she wasn't expecting that answer. Sophie's fingers curled against her dress as she studied him again. "Do you want to be our daddy?" she finally asked. Andrew didn't even hesitate. "More than anything." For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then, to his complete surprise, Emily took a step closer and held out her small hand. Andrew stared at it for a second before slowly reaching out, his much larger hand wrapping around hers. Her grip was small but firm, and the warmth of it sent a strange wave of emotion rushing through him. Sophie hesitated for a moment longer before stepping forward too, taking his other hand. "Okay," she whispered. Andrew swallowed the lump in his throat, his entire world narrowing down to the two tiny hands holding onto his own. He wasn't sure what the future was going to look like. He wasn't sure how he was supposed to navigate any of this. But as he looked at his daughters, his daughters, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going anywhere. Andrew didn't know what he had expected from that first meeting, but as he walked away from the cafe, his mind was still trying to process everything that had just happened. The weight of his daughter's small hands in his own had lingered even after they had let go, and for the first time in his life, he had felt something that had nothing to do with business, power, or success. He had felt the terrifying, all-consuming reality that he was responsible for two little girls who had never even known he existed until today. Kate had agreed to let him see them again, but she had been clear, it had to be gradual. They needed time to get used to the idea of him, and as much as Andrew hated the thought of waiting, he understood. He had spent 5 years absent from their lives, even if it hadn't been his fault, and now he had to earn a place in them. That realization settled deep in his chest as he sat in his office later that evening, staring out over the city skyline. He had spent years building an empire, making a name for himself, but none of it had ever made him feel the way he had felt when Emily and Sophie had looked up at him and called him their daddy for the first time. When his phone buzzed, he glanced at the screen, surprised to see Kate's name. He hesitated for only a second before answering. "Hey," he said, leaning back in his chair. Kate's voice was softer than usual, almost hesitant. "The girls have been talking about you non-stop since we left the cafe. Emily keeps asking if you have a big office like the ones in cartoons, and Sophie wants to know if you ever fought a dragon." Andrew let out a breath of a laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. "I hate to disappoint them, but I don't think running a company is nearly as exciting as fighting dragons." Kate was quiet for a moment before she spoke again. "They want to see you again. Soon." His heart skipped a beat. Yeah, she admitted. "I was going to wait a little longer, but I think if I do, they'll just keep asking until I give in." Andrew smiled at the thought, a warmth spreading through his chest. "I'm okay with that. What do you have in mind?" Kate hesitated before answering. "Something small. Something easy. Maybe the park. Somewhere they feel comfortable." Andrew nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "The park sounds perfect." They agreed on a time, and after they hung up, Andrew found himself staring at his phone for a long moment. This was happening. He was going to see them again, not as strangers, not as the man who had unknowingly bought them teddy bears in a toy store, but as their father. It was terrifying, overwhelming, and yet, for the first time in years, something in his life felt like it was exactly where it was supposed to be. When the day arrived, Andrew was standing at the entrance of the park before they even got there, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat as he scanned the area. He had never been one for nervousness, but now, as he waited for Kate and the girls to arrive, he felt a kind of anxiety he had never experienced before. He wasn't used to being uncertain, to feeling like the outcome of something was completely out of his control. Then he saw them. Emily and Sophie were running ahead of Kate, their blonde hair bouncing as they raced toward the swings. Kate followed at a slower pace, giving him a brief nod before motioning toward the girls. "They're excited," she said. "And a little nervous." Andrew let out a breath. "Me too." Kate's lips curved slightly. "You'll be fine." He wasn't sure if that was true, but he appreciated the attempt at reassurance. The girls were already climbing onto the swings when they finally noticed him standing nearby. Emily waved first, her little face lighting up. "You came." Andrew smiled. "Of course I did." Sophie tilted her head. "Did you bring a dragon?" He chuckled, walking closer. "Not this time. But maybe next time." Emily kicked her feet, trying to get the swing moving. "Can you push us?" For a moment, Andrew just stood there, struck by how natural the request was. They weren't treating him like a stranger, weren't acting like they were unsure about him being here. They were just two little girls who wanted their dad to push them on the swings. "Yeah," he said, stepping behind them. "I can do that." He started slow, his hands carefully pressing against their backs as they swung higher. Their laughter filled the air, and for the first time in his life, Andrew realized that success didn't have to come from boardrooms or bank accounts. Sometimes, it was as simple as being here. Andrew had never thought something as simple as an afternoon at the park could mean so much. He had spent years negotiating million-dollar deals, attending high-profile events, and making decisions that affected thousands of people, but none of it had ever felt as significant as this moment, standing behind his daughters, pushing them on the swings, listening to their laughter as they soared higher into the air. It was the kind of moment he had never allowed himself to imagine, yet now that he was here, he couldn't believe he had almost missed it. Emily was the more adventurous of the two, leaning back slightly as she swung higher, her blonde curls bouncing in the wind. Sophie, on the other hand, was more cautious, giggling nervously whenever her feet left the ground for a second too long. He quickly learned their limits, how much of a push was just right for Sophie, how Emily liked to go higher, how they both squealed with laughter when he surprised them by giving them an extra little boost. After a while, they slowed down, dragging their feet against the dirt to stop the swings. Sophie hopped off first, running toward the slide, while Emily turned to face him, her blue eyes filled with curiosity. "Do you come to the park a lot?" she asked, tilting her head. Andrew let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "Not really. I don't think I've been to a park since I was a kid." Emily frowned as if that was the strangest thing she had ever heard. "But where do you play?" He hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to answer that. He had spent so much of his life working, pushing himself harder, climbing higher, that the idea of just playing, just enjoying life for the sake of it, felt completely foreign to him. "I guess I never really thought about it," he admitted. Emily seemed to consider this before taking his hand and giving it a small tug. "Come on," she said. "Let's go play." Andrew glanced at Kate, who was watching them from a nearby bench with a knowing smile, and then back at Emily, who was already pulling him toward the jungle gym. He had never been one to say no to a challenge, and if his daughter thought he needed to learn how to play, he wasn't going to argue. For the next hour, Andrew did things he never thought he'd do. He climbed through tunnels too small for him, slid down slides that were clearly not designed for adults, and even found himself on a seesaw with Sophie, who giggled every time she went up in the air. It was ridiculous, it was childish, and yet he couldn't remember the last time he had laughed so much. At one point, he was helping Sophie build a sandcastle near the edge of the playground when Emily plopped down beside him, resting her chin on her hands. "You're funny," she said, watching him carefully. Andrew raised an eyebrow. "Funny how?" She shrugged. "I thought daddies were supposed to be serious all the time. But you're not." Something about that statement made his heart tighten. He had spent his whole life being serious, being the man people expected him to be. But with them, with his daughters, he didn't have to be that person. He could just be Dad. "I can be serious sometimes," he said with a smirk. "But only when I have to." Emily grinned. "Good. Because serious is boring." Sophie nodded in agreement, patting the top of their sandcastle. "We like you not boring." Andrew felt something shift deep inside him, something he couldn't quite put into words. They liked him. Not because he was successful or powerful, not because he had bought them toys or taken them to the park. They liked him just because he was there. Kate called them over a few minutes later, letting them know it was time to go. Andrew felt a pang of disappointment, realizing he wasn't ready for the day to end. He had spent so much of his life chasing the next big thing, always looking ahead, always focused on what came next. But today, for the first time, he just wanted to stay in the moment. As they walked toward the parking lot, Sophie reached up and took his hand without a second thought. He glanced down at her, surprised, but she just smiled up at him like it was the most natural thing in the world. Emily, not wanting to be left out, grabbed his other hand, swinging their arms back and forth as they walked. Andrew caught Kate watching them, her expression unreadable. For a moment, he worried she would pull them away, remind them to take things slow, but instead, she just gave him a small nod, an unspoken agreement that, at least for now, this was okay. When they reached Kate's car, Sophie turned to him, her little face serious. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" Andrew crouched down so he was at eye level with both of them. "If you want me to." Emily nodded without hesitation. "Yes." Sophie grinned. "Then you have to." Andrew smiled, feeling something settle inside him, something that had been restless ever since he had found out about them. "Okay. I'll be here." Kate watched the exchange carefully, and when the girls climbed into the car, she hesitated for a moment before speaking. "They like you." Andrew met her gaze. "I like them too." She nodded slowly, as if trying to decide whether or not to believe him. "Then don't disappoint them." Her words weren't a threat, but they carried weight. He knew that after 5 years of raising them on her own, after 5 years of making every decision for them, trusting him wasn't going to be easy for her. And he didn't blame her. "I won't," he said simply. Kate studied him for a moment longer before finally nodding. "See you tomorrow, then." As he watched them drive away, Andrew realized something. For the first time in his life, he had something worth showing up for. And he wasn't going to let it go. Andrew had always believed that his success was measured by what he built, the deals he closed, the companies he expanded, the numbers in his bank account. But as the days passed, as he spent more time with Emily and Sophie, he started to realize that none of that compared to what he was building now. The next afternoon, as promised, he showed up at the park again, but this time, something was different. When the girls saw him, they didn't hesitate. They didn't study him with cautious curiosity or treat him like someone they were still trying to figure out. Instead, they ran straight toward him, their little feet kicking up dust as they threw themselves at his legs, wrapping their small arms around him without a second thought. For a moment, Andrew just stood there, completely still, trying to process the fact that his daughters were hugging him like he belonged to them. He wasn't sure what to do with the unexpected warmth flooding his chest, so he did the only thing that made sense, he crouched down and hugged them back. Kate watched from a few steps away, her arms crossed over her chest, but there was no tension in her face this time. Just something softer, something almost hesitant, as if she wasn't sure whether to trust what she was seeing. Sophie was the first to pull back, her blue eyes shining as she grinned up at him. "We thought maybe you forgot." Andrew smirked, ruffling her blonde curls. "I told you I'd be here." Emily looked at him seriously. "People say things sometimes, but then they don't come." Something about the way she said it made his stomach twist, and he glanced up at Kate, who was already looking away, pretending to focus on something else. He realized then that this wasn't just about proving himself to his daughters. It was about proving himself to their mother, too. He exhaled and looked back at Emily. "Well, I'm not just people. I'm your dad." Emily studied him for a moment before finally nodding, as if deciding that was an acceptable answer. Then she grabbed his hand, tugging him toward the jungle gym. "Come on, we have a game to play." The afternoon passed in a blur of laughter and small victories. Sophie made him sit on the grass and watch as she tried, and failed, to do a cartwheel, giggling each time she landed sideways. Emily insisted he help her climb the monkey bars, and when she finally made it across, she beamed at him with a kind of pride that made something in his chest ache. Kate stayed nearby, watching, but she didn't interfere. She let him be their dad. As the sun began to set, they all made their way back to the parking lot, the girls walking in front of them, still holding their teddy bears from the toy store as they chatted about the best part of the day. Kate glanced at him. "You're good with them." Andrew looked at her, surprised. It was the first time she had acknowledged that. "I don't know what I'm doing half the time," he admitted. "I'm just trying to figure it out as I go." She smiled slightly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Welcome to parenting." He let out a soft chuckle. "You make it look easy." She shook her head. "It's not. But it's worth it." He nodded, watching his daughters walk ahead of them, their small hands swinging in the air as they talked. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It is." As they reached the car, Emily turned around. "Can we see you again tomorrow?" Andrew didn't even hesitate. "Of course." Sophie looked at him with wide eyes. "And the day after?" He crouched down so he was at their level. "I'll be there for as many days as you want me to be." Emily grinned. "Forever?" Andrew felt his throat tighten. He looked up at Kate, whose face was unreadable, before turning back to his daughters. "Forever." Kate didn't say anything as she helped them into the car, but before she closed the door, she looked at him for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. He had a lot to make up for. He had lost years he could never get back. But he had today, and he had tomorrow. And for the first time in his life, he knew exactly what he was fighting for. The ending of this story carries a deep emotional weight because it is not just about a man discovering he has children, it is about redemption, second chances, and the power of love to reshape even the most rigid of lives. Andrew starts as a man who thrives on control, who believes success is measured by power and achievements. But through Emily and Sophie, he learns that true success isn't about money or status, it's about showing up, about being there for the people who need you the most. Kate's journey is just as significant. She made a choice years ago out of fear, out of a desire to protect her daughters from disappointment. She believed she was doing what was best, but in the process, she denied them the chance to know their father. Watching her lower her walls, seeing her begin to trust Andrew, is just as much a transformation as his own. But the heart of this story lies with Emily and Sophie. They are innocent, full of unconditional love, and open to letting someone new into their world. They are the ones who teach Andrew what it means to be a father, not through grand gestures, but through the small, everyday moments that build a real bond. Their acceptance of him isn't about his wealth or success, but simply because he is theirs. The final moments, where Andrew promises to be there forever, are a powerful reflection of how far he has come. In the beginning, he was a man who had no idea what he was missing. By the end, he knows exactly what he has found, and he refuses to let it go. It's a story about finding what truly matters, about taking responsibility, and about learning that love, real, unconditional love, is the most valuable thing a person can have. The past can't be changed, but the future is built on choices. And Andrew, for the first time in his life, is choosing something greater than himself. A millionaire CEO left his wife for another woman. Years later, he wept when he saw her with the daughter he never knew. Alexander Blake had always believed he was the kind of man who could separate his heart from his ambition. From the day he founded his first company, he built his life on discipline, calculated decisions, and the conviction that nothing should matter more than success. He wore the same style of tailored suit every day, dark fabric that set off his cold blue eyes, and he surrounded himself with people who admired his precision and feared his judgment. When he married Skylar, some of his colleagues were surprised. She was everything he was not, warm, hopeful, too willing to see the good in people. She was beautiful, her blonde hair shining in any light, and for a brief time he almost convinced himself that her softness wouldn't be an obstacle. But over the years, the gap between them widened until it became a chasm neither of them knew how to cross. Skylar tried, again and again, to remind him that they were supposed to be building a life together rather than existing as two strangers sharing the same address. She left small notes in his briefcase, messages that said she loved him or missed him, but he rarely even unfolded them. When she asked him to have dinner at home instead of taking every meal at work or in restaurants, he promised he would, but somehow he never did. She told herself it was just the pressure of his career, that it would get better once the next merger was finalized. But in her heart she knew he was choosing to keep her at arm's length because it was easier for him not to care too much. It was an evening like any other when everything finally broke. She had waited up for him in the living room, her hands clasped in her lap, the soft yellow light catching in her hair. She had been crying long before he came home, but she had wiped her face and tried to steady her breathing. She didn't want to sound hysterical. She just wanted him to hear her. He set down his phone with the practiced impatience of a man who thought every conversation was a distraction from something more important. Before he could speak, she said his name, and something in her voice made him pause. "I can't keep pretending this doesn't hurt me," she whispered. He didn't respond. She looked up at him, searching for even a flicker of the man she had married, but all she saw was exhaustion and indifference. She told him she felt like she was disappearing, that she couldn't remember the last time he'd asked her what she needed. Her voice broke when she said she loved him but didn't know how to live like this anymore. He was silent for so long she thought maybe he would turn and walk away without a word. Instead, he let out a slow breath, his expression flat, and said, "I can't do this anymore either. I need a different life." Her throat closed, and she pressed a hand to her chest as if she could keep her heart from falling apart. "A different life?" she echoed. He nodded, as though they were discussing a quarterly budget instead of the end of everything that had ever mattered to her. "I'm sorry," he said, though he didn't sound sorry. "I just can't keep pretending this marriage works." The rest was a blur. He left the house without looking back, and she sat there on the edge of the couch, too stunned to cry. She didn't know then that the moment he closed the door was the moment he closed the chapter of his life that could never be reopened. She didn't know she was already carrying a part of him he would spend years wishing he had stayed to meet. Skylar didn't leave right away because for several days she couldn't make herself believe it was really over. She woke each morning expecting to hear his familiar footsteps outside the bedroom door or the muted sound of his voice on a business call. When the hours passed in silence, the truth began to sink into her bones like something cold and heavy. She moved through the rooms of their house like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, touching the back of the chair where he always draped his jacket, running her fingers over the smooth kitchen counter where he used to set his briefcase, feeling smaller each time she realized he was never coming back. The bed felt too big. The quiet was unbearable. She tried to fill it with music and phone calls to the few friends she still trusted, but nothing could disguise the fact that she was alone. She thought she would feel angry, but mostly she felt hollow. It was as if all the years of trying to hold them together had drained her of the strength to hate him properly. She wanted to scream at him, to demand an explanation for why he had chosen someone else, but the last conversation they'd shared replayed in her mind over and over. The flat tone of his voice when he told her he needed a different life was worse than any shouting match. He had sounded so sure, so resolved, that there was no hope left to argue for. She began to understand that nothing she could have said would have made him stay. When she realized she was late, that her body was telling her something she hadn't dared imagine, she sat on the bathroom floor with her hand pressed flat over her belly, her heart hammering so hard she thought she might faint. For a long time she stayed there, staring at the test in her hand, and let the tears fall in silence. It was almost cruel how quickly the knowledge shifted everything. She wasn't just a woman left behind. She was a mother now, whether he ever came back or not. The thought terrified her. It also gave her the smallest flicker of purpose in the darkness. She knew she couldn't stay in that house, surrounded by ghosts of a life she had already lost. She began packing slowly, methodically, folding her clothes with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She took only what she needed, leaving behind the things that had been part of their shared story, the framed photos on the mantel, the wedding china, the pressed flower he'd given her once in the early days when he still knew how to be tender. By the time she zipped her suitcase, she felt like she had shed a skin she could never wear again. She moved to a small town 2 hours away where no one knew her last name. The landlord didn't ask why she needed the place immediately or why her voice shook when she handed over the deposit. The apartment was small, just a living room and 1 bedroom, but it was clean and quiet, and it was hers. She lay awake on the first night listening to the unfamiliar creaks of the old pipes and realized she was more afraid than she had ever been. But she also felt something close to relief because at least here she would not have to pretend. When her belly began to swell beneath her clothes, she wrapped her arms around it every morning before getting out of bed, reminding herself that she was not truly alone. At her first doctor's appointment, she sat in the waiting room with her hands folded tight in her lap, wondering if she would ever feel strong enough to do this by herself. But when she heard the heartbeat, fast and steady, she closed her eyes and let a single sob escape her throat. It was the first sound she had made in weeks that wasn't just grief. She found work at a small bookstore that didn't care that she was pregnant. The owner, a woman named Nancy with a kind smile and tired eyes, let her sit behind the counter when her feet began to ache. Skylar learned to sort the shipments and stack the displays, grateful for something to occupy her mind. At night, she lay with her hand resting over the curve of her stomach, whispering promises to the baby she carried. She promised that she would never leave. She promised that she would try, every day, to be enough for both of them. She knew she couldn't change what Alexander had done. She couldn't undo the choice he made to walk away. But she could choose something different for herself and for her child. And in the quiet of that tiny apartment, she decided that surviving would be the first thing she taught her daughter. The months that followed were measured in small, private milestones no one else saw. Skylar counted them carefully, the first time she felt the baby turn inside her like a promise she wasn't sure she deserved, the day she found the second-hand crib someone had left by the dumpster and spent hours scrubbing it clean, the moment she caught her reflection in the bathroom mirror and almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her cheeks had hollowed, her hair hung in a limp braid over her shoulder, and her eyes were tired in a way that went deeper than lost sleep. But there was something steadier in her expression too, a quiet determination she hadn't known she possessed until there was no other choice. She stopped following the news about Alexander, though sometimes his name still found her by accident. Once, when she was standing in line at the grocery store, she glanced at a glossy magazine near the register and saw his face staring back. He looked the same as always, impeccable in his dark suit, a practiced smile on his lips. The headline called him a visionary. She turned the magazine face down and set her groceries on the belt, her hands trembling so hard she nearly dropped the bread. The cashier asked if she was all right, and Skylar nodded without meeting her eyes. She walked home with her shopping bag clutched to her chest, repeating silently that it didn't matter anymore, that he didn't matter. But that night, after she put away the groceries and sat on the edge of her bed, she allowed herself the truth she never spoke aloud. A part of her still missed the idea of him, the man she had loved before he decided he needed a different life. When her daughter finally arrived in the early hours of a cold autumn morning, Skylar felt a fear so huge it nearly crushed her. She was alone in the small delivery room, gripping the rails of the bed while nurses moved briskly around her. She had never imagined bringing a child into the world without a hand to hold. But when the final push came and she heard a sharp, indignant cry, something inside her cracked wide open. The nurse placed the baby on her chest, and Skylar looked down into a tiny, perfect face framed by dark hair that already reminded her of someone she wasn't ready to forgive. The baby blinked up at her with clear blue eyes, and all the loneliness of the past year dissolved in an instant. She named her Olivia. In those first days at home, Skylar felt like she was learning how to breathe again. Every routine, feeding, rocking, changing tiny diapers, was clumsy at first. She cried as often as the baby did. But when Olivia wrapped a tiny hand around her finger, Skylar discovered that there was still room inside her heart for love that was pure and untainted by disappointment. Money was tight in ways that sometimes kept her awake at night. The bookstore job ended when she couldn't stand behind a counter with a newborn strapped to her chest. She found work cleaning offices after hours, carrying Olivia along in her carrier, pausing every few minutes to check if she was still sleeping. Some nights she came home so tired she thought her legs would give out on the stairs. But even when her body ached and her mind was clouded with worry, she never once wished she had chosen differently. Olivia was the only part of her life that felt like it had never been a mistake. When Olivia was old enough to giggle, to clutch at her hair and babble nonsense, Skylar began to feel the first fragile pieces of herself knitting back together. She learned to stop imagining what it would have been like if Alexander had stayed. She stopped picturing him in the delivery room or beside her at the kitchen table. Instead, she focused on each ordinary miracle, the weight of her daughter asleep on her chest, the softness of her hair under Skylar's palm, the way her laughter filled every empty space. She told herself that this was enough, that the life she was building didn't need his shadow in it. But some nights, after Olivia finally surrendered to sleep and the apartment went quiet again, Skylar would stand by the window, looking out at the streetlight shining through the trees. She would press her hand to the glass and admit to the darkness that no matter how much time passed, a small part of her still wanted him to see what he had left behind. She didn't want his pity or his excuses. She only wanted him to know that what he had abandoned had become something beautiful without him. And then she would turn away and close the curtains because she refused to let that longing shape her life any longer. It was almost 4 years to the day since Skylar had last seen Alexander when everything she thought she had buried resurfaced with a single unexpected encounter. She hadn't planned to be anywhere near the city he called his domain. She hadn't even planned to leave town that morning. But Olivia had developed a cough that worried her enough to take the first appointment she could get, which happened to be at the children's clinic across from one of the tall glass towers that still bore Alexander's name in silver letters over the entrance. She told herself it didn't matter. She would be in and out. No one would see her. No ghosts would rise up from behind those mirrored windows to remind her how much she had lost. She had bundled Olivia in her warm pink coat, the one with the big buttons she loved to fiddle with. On the bus ride, the little girl fell asleep leaning against her shoulder, and Skylar closed her eyes, breathing in the soft scent of her hair. For a moment, she felt steady, like everything she had rebuilt couldn't be shaken by a place or a memory. When they arrived, she carried Olivia up the clinic steps, smiling as the receptionist complimented her daughter's bright blue eyes. Those eyes were the only feature she never managed to explain away. Everyone assumed they were from Skylar's side of the family, and she never corrected them. She told herself she owed Olivia the truth someday, but she wasn't ready to give it yet. The appointment went quickly, nothing serious, just a lingering cold. They left the clinic as late afternoon light turned the glass of the office towers into sheets of gold. Skylar should have walked straight to the bus stop. She should have kept her head down and never looked back. But as she adjusted Olivia's scarf, she felt the unmistakable sense of being watched. Slowly, she lifted her gaze across the plaza, and her breath caught so sharply she thought she might choke. Alexander was standing on the steps of his building, flanked by two men in suits who were saying something to him, but he wasn't listening. His eyes were fixed on her. She had no idea how long he had been standing there, how much of her he had already taken in. She tried to look away, but she couldn't. The years fell away in an instant, and she was 26 again, standing in their kitchen while he told her he needed a different life. For several heartbeats, they simply stared at each other across the space that had grown between them. His face was older, sharper around the eyes, but the shock on it was unmistakable. She didn't know what he saw when he looked at her, whether he recognized the woman he'd left or if she was a stranger to him now. A dozen thoughts collided in her mind. She should walk away. She should protect herself, protect Olivia. But her legs wouldn't move. Then, slowly, his gaze dropped to the little girl standing at her side, holding her hand. Skylar felt the air leave her lungs as she realized this was the moment she had both dreaded and secretly wished for, the moment he saw the undeniable proof of everything he'd chosen to abandon. His eyes widened, and his lips parted as if he were about to call out, but no sound came. Olivia glanced up at her, confused by the sudden tension, and tightened her grip on her fingers. Skylar swallowed hard. She knew she couldn't let him be the first to speak. She didn't want her daughter's memory of this day to begin with the sound of his voice. So she bent down and brushed a stray hair from Olivia's cheek, her hand trembling just slightly. "Come on, sweetheart," she said as calmly as she could manage. "It's time to go home." But when she straightened, Alexander had already crossed half the distance between them. She saw him move with a determination that was at odds with the shock still etched into his features. One of his colleagues called after him, but he didn't turn back. His eyes were locked on Olivia, then on her, and Skylar felt the ground tilt under her feet. He stopped a few paces away, breathing hard as though he'd run the whole way. "Skylar," he said, and her name on his lips made something sharp and aching twist inside her chest. He looked at her as if he needed her to confirm what he already knew. His voice was unsteady when he spoke again. "Is she?" Skylar lifted her chin, refusing to flinch. She saw a crowd gathering around them at the edges of the plaza, people pretending not to watch. She didn't care. She had carried this truth alone for too long to be ashamed of it now. "Her name is Olivia," she said evenly. "And yes. She's your daughter." The last of the color drained from his face. For a moment, she thought he might fall. His hand came up to cover his mouth, and in his eyes she saw something she never thought she'd see in him, raw, naked regret. The world around them kept moving, cars and voices and late afternoon shadows, but for Skylar, time stopped. She didn't know what he would say next. She didn't know what she would allow herself to hear. All she knew was that nothing could ever be the same again. For a long moment, Alexander just stood there in front of her, his breathing ragged, as if every word he needed had abandoned him. The polished glass facade behind him reflected the image of the man he had spent years becoming, powerful, composed, unreachable. But standing here, with the late sunlight catching in Olivia's hair and Skylar's gaze locked on his, he looked nothing like that figure. He looked like someone whose entire foundation had just cracked open. Skylar tried to keep her expression calm, but inside she felt like she was standing too close to a cliff's edge. Olivia pressed closer to her leg, sensing the weight of the moment even if she didn't understand it. Skylar rested her hand gently on her daughter's shoulder and forced herself to breathe evenly, because she would not let him see her afraid. Alexander's hand dropped from his mouth, and he swallowed with effort. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded hoarse and unfamiliar. "I didn't know," he said. The words seemed pulled out of him like something painful. "Skylar, I swear to you, I didn't know you were pregnant when I left." She didn't answer right away because she had imagined this conversation too many times. In her mind, she had always been prepared to unleash every piece of anger she had stored up all these years. But now that he was here, looking at her not with arrogance but with something like devastation, she found her voice quieter than she expected. "You didn't want to know," she said. "You made sure you wouldn't have to." He closed his eyes and let out a shaky exhale, as if he was bracing himself for the truth he had avoided. "You're right," he admitted. "I didn't want to look too closely because I was afraid of what I would find. I thought if I kept my distance, I could move on. But I haven't moved on, Skylar. Not for one day." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw that there were lines on his face she hadn't noticed before, tiny betrayals of time and the way it changed a man whether he admitted it or not. Part of her felt a flicker of cruel satisfaction to see he hadn't been immune to consequence. But there was no relief in it. It didn't give her back the nights she had spent alone with a feverish baby or the mornings she woke up wondering how she was going to keep the lights on. She felt her throat tighten, but she refused to look away. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come over here? Why try to talk to me at all?" He hesitated as if searching for an answer that wouldn't sound hollow. "Because I saw her," he finally said, his voice low. "And in that moment I knew I'd made the worst mistake of my life." His gaze dropped to Olivia, who was still pressed against her, watching him with wide, uncertain eyes. "She looks like you," he whispered. "But when she looked up at me, it was like seeing myself all over again. And I don't even know her name." The confession did something to her composure, a small crack she couldn't quite seal. She swallowed and smoothed Olivia's hair, needing something solid to touch. "You don't get to expect anything from us," she said. "You walked away. You left me to figure this out on my own. I don't care what you regret." His eyes lifted, and for the first time she saw them filled with something unguarded and painfully human. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I don't expect you to let me in. But please, can I at least talk to her?" Skylar felt her pulse hammering in her throat. Everything in her wanted to say no, to protect the small, safe world she had built around her daughter. But she looked at Olivia and thought about how many times she had asked where her daddy was, why she didn't have one like the other children at daycare. And she knew she would have to face this moment eventually. It was better that it happened on her terms than by accident later. She knelt beside Olivia and met her daughter's confused gaze. "Liv," she said softly, her voice trembling just a little, "this is someone who knew Mama a long time ago." Olivia studied her with solemn curiosity, then looked at Alexander, her small brow furrowing. Skylar's throat tightened even more, but she forced herself to go on. "His name is Alexander," she said. He's your father." The word fell between them like something too heavy to lift. For an instant, no one spoke. Then Olivia looked back up at her, her eyes wide. "Daddy," she said, testing the word as if it were a foreign language. Skylar closed her eyes and let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. When she looked back up, Alexander had sunk to one knee, his face pale and stricken, and there was nothing polished or powerful about him anymore. He just looked like a man who had finally realized the cost of everything he'd thrown away. Alexander didn't know how long he stayed kneeling there on the pavement, but eventually he became aware of how many people were slowing down to look. He didn't care. For years, he had built his reputation on never letting emotion interfere with his decisions, but standing in front of Skylar and the little girl he hadn't known existed, he felt like the man he had been was a stranger to him now. He looked up at Olivia, who was staring at him with the quiet, serious attention children sometimes gave to things they didn't fully understand. Her blue eyes were so much like his own that it made his chest ache. He wanted to reach for her, to say something that would make this easier, but he had no idea how to speak to a child whose first years he had missed completely. Skylar shifted beside her daughter, her hand resting protectively on Olivia's shoulder. There was no anger in her expression anymore, only a kind of tired wariness that made him feel even smaller. He understood that she was allowing this moment not for his sake, but for Olivia's. That knowledge humbled him more than any failure in business ever had. He swallowed, trying to steady his voice, and said the only thing that came to him. "Hi, Olivia," he managed, his tone soft, unsure. I'm sorry I wasn't here before." The little girl tilted her head, studying him the way she would study something unfamiliar but interesting, and he felt his throat tighten with the effort it took not to cry. Skylar spoke next, her voice quiet but firm. "You need to understand that she doesn't know you," she said. "You can't just appear and expect this to make sense to her." He nodded immediately. "I don't expect anything," he said quickly. I couldn't walk away again. I had to at least look her in the eye and tell her that I know I failed." His gaze flicked down to the sidewalk. "And that I'm sorry." A silence stretched between them, full of all the things neither of them could bring themselves to say. Olivia shifted her weight from foot to foot, then reached for her mother's hand. Skylar glanced down and gave her a reassuring squeeze before meeting Alexander's eyes again. "We were just about to go home," she said. There was no invitation in her tone, but no final dismissal either. He understood that this was as much as she could offer, and it was more than he deserved. He nodded again, feeling unsteady. "I can walk you," he said, his voice low. "If that's all right." Skylar hesitated, and for a moment he was sure she would refuse. But after a long pause, she gave a small nod. She turned to Olivia and brushed the hair from her forehead. "We'll take the bus home, sweetheart," she murmured. Olivia glanced between them with wide, questioning eyes but didn't protest. Skylar lifted the strap of her bag higher on her shoulder and began walking toward the corner. Alexander fell into step a few paces behind them, afraid to get too close. They moved slowly along the sidewalk as the shadows grew longer, and Alexander realized he was memorizing every detail. The way Olivia skipped over the cracks in the pavement, the way Skylar kept glancing back to make sure he hadn't disappeared. He wanted to tell her that he wouldn't vanish again, but he knew words meant nothing without proof. He thought about all the birthdays and bedtime stories he had missed, all the nights Skylar had sat alone, and he wondered how he had ever convinced himself that success was worth more than this. When they reached the bus stop, Skylar turned to face him. Her expression was careful, composed, but he could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "You can't expect her to understand what you are to her yet," she said. "I won't let you confuse her or make promises you don't keep." He felt the weight of her gaze and nodded. "I'm not asking you to trust me," he said. "I'm just asking for the chance to be here. To do this the right way, even if it's too late." A horn blared as the bus approached, and Olivia turned, her small face brightening at the familiar sound. Skylar took her hand and guided her toward the open doors. Before she stepped up, she looked back at him one last time. Her voice was very soft when she spoke. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," she said. "But she deserves the truth." He swallowed hard, feeling something loosen painfully in his chest. "I know," he said simply. And then she turned away, leading Olivia up the steps into the bus. As the doors closed, Olivia pressed her hand to the window, her palm small and tentative against the glass. Alexander lifted his own hand in answer, and for a fleeting moment, her blue eyes met his. When the bus pulled away, he stood there long after it disappeared, feeling like he was finally beginning to understand everything he had lost and everything he still hoped to find. Alexander returned to that same bus stop the next day because he didn't know what else to do. He told himself he had meetings, calls, a life that still needed his attention, but none of it felt real anymore. All he could think about was the way Olivia had looked at him through the glass, her hand pressed to the window like she wasn't sure whether to wave or not. He spent the night in a hotel only a few blocks from where Skylar lived, staring at the ceiling as dawn crept slowly across the unfamiliar walls. Every hour that passed made it clearer to him that he couldn't pretend his life had meaning without trying to make amends, no matter how hopeless it seemed. When the first light of morning touched the tops of the trees, he walked the neighborhood for over an hour before he finally gathered the courage to approach their building. It was small, older than he expected, with paint peeling on the trim and a narrow flight of steps leading to the door. He tried not to imagine Skylar carrying groceries up those stairs while Olivia tugged at her sleeve. He had never thought much about how she lived, too certain that if she needed something she would have asked. Now he realized she had never trusted him enough to believe he would help. He waited on the sidewalk, unsure whether knocking on her door unannounced was the right thing. He wanted to respect her boundaries, but he also couldn't bear the idea that if he walked away now, she would think he had changed his mind again. He was still standing there when the door finally opened. Skylar appeared first, dressed simply in jeans and a soft gray sweater, her hair pulled back from her face. She looked tired, but when her eyes met his, they were clear and steady. Olivia followed a moment later, clutching a small stuffed rabbit to her chest. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The street around them began to fill with the sounds of morning, the rumble of delivery trucks, a dog barking in a yard nearby, the laughter of children further down the block. All of it felt strangely muted, as if you were watching it from the other side of thick glass. Finally Skylar lifted her chin, her voice calm. "You can walk with us to school if you want," she said, and though her words were simple, he felt them settle in his chest like something fragile he didn't dare touch too quickly. He nodded, falling into step beside them as they started down the cracked sidewalk. Olivia didn't say anything at first. She kept her eyes on her shoes, her small hand wrapped tightly around her mother's. He didn't push her to look at him. He only watched her and tried to memorize the way the crown of her hair parted perfectly over the curve of her head, how the edge of her pink coat brushed her knees as she walked. He had missed every tiny detail, and he knew he could never get that time back. Skylar didn't try to fill the silence, and he was grateful. They reached the corner where the school gates stood open, children streaming inside with bright backpacks. Olivia finally glanced up at him, her expression wary but curious. He crouched down so he could look her in the eye without towering over her. "Hi again," he said softly, and to his amazement, she didn't flinch. She studied his face like she was trying to decide what to do with him. Then she shifted her weight and turned her face into her mother's hip, hiding. He felt something sharp twist behind his ribs, but he didn't let it show. He knew this was what he deserved. Skylar touched Olivia's hair, smoothing it back, then looked at him. "She's shy with people she doesn't know well," she said. "You can't expect her to feel comfortable right away." He nodded quickly. "I don't," he said. "I'll wait as long as it takes." He stood again and stepped back, giving them space. Skylar's gaze held his for a moment longer, searching, measuring, and then she nodded once. "We'll be back here at 3, she said. "If you want to come then." He swallowed, unable to speak around the knot in his throat. He only nodded, and she turned to lead Olivia inside. He watched them walk through the gates until they disappeared into the crowd. The rest of the day passed in slow motion. He tried to focus on his work calls in the hotel lobby, but every time he closed his eyes, all he saw was Olivia's small face turning shyly away. At 5 minutes to 3, he was already waiting at the corner. When they reappeared, Olivia was holding a piece of construction paper painted with bright yellow flowers. She was talking softly to Skylar, her free hand gesturing as she described something important. She didn't notice him until they were almost beside him. When she did, she stopped, her eyes going wide, and looked up at her mother. Skylar waited, giving her a chance to decide for herself. Slowly, Olivia stepped closer to him, lifting her artwork for him to see. He knelt again, his heart beating so loudly he could hardly hear. "These are flowers," she said in a small voice. "I painted them for Mama." "They're beautiful," he said, and for once his voice didn't shake. "You're a very good artist." She studied him for another moment, then nodded solemnly as if she had decided something important. Without a word, she reached out and pressed the paper into his hands. It was the smallest gesture, but it felt like the beginning of everything he had thought he'd lost forever. The days that followed blurred together in a rhythm Alexander had never known before. Each morning he woke with the same nervous ache in his chest, unsure if Skylar would allow him to come along or if Olivia would even look at him. He never assumed he was welcome, but he showed up all the same, standing at the end of the walkway until Skylar lifted her hand in a cautious greeting. He learned to walk beside them without reaching for Olivia's hand, letting her decide when she felt safe enough to stand close. He watched her grow a little braver each day, first glancing up at him, then asking shy questions, and finally offering her drawings as if they were tokens of cautious trust. One afternoon as they left the school, Olivia surprised him by slipping her small hand into his without looking up. Her palm was warm and soft, and he held it gently, terrified he might somehow scare her away by holding too tightly. Skylar noticed but didn't comment, only watched them with an expression he couldn't quite read. For the rest of the walk home, Olivia chattered about a book she'd read, pausing now and then to make sure he was listening. He answered every question, even the smallest ones, feeling something uncoil in his chest he hadn't known was there. It was a kind of quiet peace he had never found in boardrooms or penthouses or the long hours spent chasing respect from people he didn't even like. That evening, Skylar invited him inside for tea. It was the first time he'd crossed the threshold of their apartment. He removed his shoes carefully and stood in the narrow entry, taking in the walls hung with Olivia's paintings and a tiny kitchen where Skylar moved like someone who had built a life out of necessity instead of choice. She poured tea and set 2 cups on the small table, then sat across from him without meeting his eyes. For a while neither of them spoke. The only sound was Olivia humming softly to herself in the next room. Finally Skylar drew in a steadying breath. "I don't know what you expect from me," she said, her voice low but even. "I'm not ready to pretend the past didn't happen." "I don't expect you to," he said at once, because he had rehearsed this in his head 100 times. "I don't want you to forgive me if you can't. I only want to be here. To know her. To help." She looked up then, and her eyes were tired but not unkind. "You can't fix what you broke by showing up for a few weeks," she said. "She doesn't understand why you were gone. One day she will." "I know," he whispered. "And when that day comes, I'll tell her the truth. That I was a coward, and that it was my fault. Not yours." Her gaze held his for a long time, searching for any sign that he was lying. Finally she nodded, as if she had decided to believe him a little. "I'm not making any promises," she said quietly. "I'm not asking for any," he replied. After a while Olivia wandered in with her stuffed rabbit, climbing into Skylar's lap. She looked at him, her blue eyes solemn, and he realized she was waiting for something. He opened his arms a little, not sure if she'd understand the invitation. To his astonishment, she slipped off Skylar's lap and crossed the small space to crawl into his. Her head rested against his shoulder, and he held very still, as if any sudden movement would break the spell. Skylar didn't say anything, but her eyes glistened. For the first time since the afternoon in the plaza, she didn't look like she was bracing for disappointment. She looked almost at peace. Later, when it was time to leave, he gently set Olivia back on her feet. She reached for her mother's hand but turned to look at him with a small, tired smile. He felt something in his chest pull tight and then loosen, as if it were finally safe to breathe. At the door, Skylar met his gaze one last time. "You can come tomorrow," she said, her voice soft. He nodded, unable to speak around the ache in his throat. As he stepped into the cool night air, he felt a kind of quiet certainty he hadn't known in years. He knew he still had everything to prove, that trust would take time, that forgiveness might never come. But he also knew that for the first time in his life, he was exactly where he belonged. I think the ending of this story is quietly powerful because it doesn't pretend that love or regret alone can erase years of absence. What makes it satisfying is how honest it is about the consequences of Alexander's choices. He doesn't get an instant reunion or unconditional forgiveness, he gets a chance to show, day by day, that he can be better. I appreciate that Skylar's response is cautious but hopeful. She doesn't let him back into her life because she's still in love with who he was, she lets him in because she sees he's finally taking responsibility. The story also respects Olivia's perspective. She's too young to understand everything, but her slow, tentative acceptance shows that children are often more open-hearted than adults, provided they feel safe. The final scene feels earned rather than sentimental. It's not a promise that everything will be perfect, just the promise that he won't disappear again. That, to me, is the most moving part, the idea that redemption doesn't come from one apology but from the choice to keep showing up, no matter how hard it is.